This is the Breaker.News podcast for the week of April 23rd, 2023. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of the Breaker.News and host of the Breaker.News podcast. Welcome to edition number 287. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support the Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the big deal feature, 14 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How has Russia's cyber war and disinformation war evolved? My guest is Marcus Kolga, founder of disinfowatch.org and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. But first, is it just me? Is it just me, or is Simon Fraser University showing its stupidity? Yes, a university administration acting stupid. Where is the evidence-based decision-making that led to the sudden April 4th shutdown of the football program after 57 years? Canada's only entry in NCAA Division II football. And where is the logic in announcing April 21st that it will stick by the decision and hire a special advisor to help decide if and when to bring back football? That was a week after 5 players sued for breach of contract. More than money, those players just want a chance to play football where they study in fall 2023. They were recruited to do both. There's money on the table from the owner of the BC Lions. There's also U Sports Canada's West Conference, waiting with open arms to welcome SFU's football team. But no, SFU is digging in its heels and preparing to throw good money after bad and pay for lawyers and a special advisor. Maybe it will take a BC Supreme Court judge to throw the flag and penalize SFU for illegal procedure and unsportsmanlike conduct. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.News podcast. My guest this week on the podcast is Marcus Kolga, the founder of disinfowatch.org and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. 14 months ago, Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops into Ukraine. Putin's illegal war is playing out around the world because of Russian hackers and disinformation networks. In this week's feature, Marcus Kolga discusses what is going on and how it has affected him. Marcus, can you talk about what it's been like in the last year since the war on Ukraine started, how it's affected your work at the Institute and disinfowatch.org in just trying to make sure the truth is out there?
Well, listen, thanks for having me on, Bob. And that's a great question. The Russian efforts to silence, analysts, journalists, activists in the West. This isn't a new phenomenon. It didn't start 14 months ago with this invasion. It's been really ongoing. There's been a slow escalation. Going back to already around 2007, 2008. When Vladimir Putin sort of recycled the Soviet era active measures, the use of disinformation, influence operations, and back then they really targeted the Baltic states, Finland, and that sort of intensified from there and really got going in 2014, and that's when I think we started, at least here in Canada, feeling some of the effects of those efforts. I've been keeping an eye on what Vladimir Putin is doing in this context since the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, and have been writing about it. And it was really in 2014 when I started getting trolled quite intensely, even before that, and so some of the tactics that have been used are, of course, intimidation, narratives that are introduced to discredit targets, including myself. We saw around 2014, 2015, 2016 as well these narratives about Ukraine being run by neo-Nazis, and even our Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland was targeted with some of these narratives, historical manipulation, suggestions that because of the work that her grandfather was doing, that she is somehow a neo-Nazi or a whitewasher of Nazi crimes. Her grandfather, of course, was the editor at a newspaper in Ukraine during the Second World War in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, and that history, that his role there has been manipulated, and all of that has really simply intensified even more so over the past 14 months. The same sort of narratives have been put out targeting the entire Ukrainian diaspora here in Canada. Individuals have been threatened. You mentioned earlier, I've personally faced a consistent barrage of threats over the past number of years, and those have continued now. And certainly the work of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has been a target of that as well. We've got a number of our senior fellows have been placed on Putin's sanctions list, and I think, in fact, there are more. The only organization that has more people, individual sanctioned, is the Parliament of Canada. So, clearly we're doing a pretty good job, I think, of exposing some of the crimes of the Putin regime, and certainly their information and influence operations. And so the latest sort of salvo that's come across is that, as you mentioned, the Russian Prosecutor General's office has sent a letter to MLI's hosting company, where the website is hosted, and has claimed that MLI has broken some sort of laws, and has demanded that the website be taken down. And of course, Russia has passed a number of very strange laws that limit speech, both domestically and internationally. It's actually criminal, not just inside of Russia, but outside of Russia. Russia has a law that would allow it to prosecute anyone who criticizes Russia's history, manipulates its history and such. And of course, some of the most recent laws that have come out outlaw anyone criticizing the war, even calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine a war at all. So again, I think it's an indication, a positive indication of the impact of the work that the Institute and its fellows are doing. And it certainly won't silence us. And in my case, where I've been the target of these sorts of efforts in the past, it's only sort of inspired me to continue working and to intensify my own efforts to expose those narratives, that they're the negative narratives, that they're the disinformation that they're promoting, and its own criminal actions, whether it's inside of Russia or in Ukraine or elsewhere.
Is there more hacking going on in 2023 versus 2022? Is there more disinformation this year, and is it different depending on the platform?
Well, sure. I mean, look, the Russian hackers are amongst the most sophisticated in the world. They've been going at this for quite some time. The first state-sponsored cyber attacks happened in 2007. They targeted Estonia, where Russian hackers took down most of Estonia's government, media, and financial infrastructure, and they were down for about a week. That wasn't all that sophisticated. That was basically what's called a denial of service attack, when these hackers basically hijack tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of computers around the world with malicious code, and use those computers to bombard targeted websites with traffic. And there's so much traffic that goes into those sites that it knocks those websites offline. The computers that host them just simply can't handle the traffic. So that's what was happening in 2007. They continue to do that. MLI's site has been attacked. It's unknown whether they were Russian hackers who engaged in these denial of service attack, or perhaps they were Chinese government hackers. But this is going on, and of course, we most recently in the Pentagon leak papers, we heard that there was a recent Russian government controlled, connected cyber attack against our gas infrastructure. Apparently, the FSB had instructed hackers to break into Enbridge's infrastructure, the infrastructure that controls the pipelines in Western Canada. The hackers, these Russian hackers, were instructed to get in there and basically ensure that they could take control of the systems that control the pipelines. Allowing them to basically control the pressure inside the pipelines, to disable various different sorts of alarms, and to ensure that they had the potential to basically cause an explosion or some sort of form of catastrophe in those pipelines. Now, Enbridge itself has said that they haven't noticed any sort of issue, and of course we haven't seen anything in the news that there would have been any sort of a disaster or any sort of explosion. But according to those leaks, the hackers had reported back to the FSB that that they had indeed gained control of those pipelines. So these sorts of activities are ongoing. I think that over the past 14 months, a lot of those hackers have focused their efforts on Ukraine and destabilizing that country, targeting critical infrastructure inside of Ukraine. And so the focus hasn't been so much on the outside, but clearly there has been some focus there. And I would imagine that Russian hackers will continue to target our critical infrastructure in the future. So we need to be far more alert to this, and ensure that we have the defenses in place to stop those sorts of cyber attacks, that Russian cyber attacks that are targeting our critical infrastructure. And of course on the disinformation file, we've definitely seen an intensification over the past 14 months. Various different narratives have been used. I mentioned earlier the narrative of the Ukrainian government being somehow controlled by or being run by neo-Nazis. A completely false narrative. Ukraine's president, of course, is a Jewish Ukrainian. He's not a Nazi, and in fact, there's not a single far-right political party even has a seat inside the Ukrainian parliament. Unlike Germany, Austria, Hungary, most European countries have members of the far right in their parliaments. Ukraine does not. So this is a narrative that is being actively promoted and amplified by Russian propagandists in order to erode Western support for Ukraine, so that Western societies no longer support the aid that we're sending them. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, some of those narratives, that specifically that neo-Nazi narrative, is actually migrating and is being amplified by platforms, far right, far left platforms, all across the democratic world, including right here in Canada. And there are a few others that seem to be creeping onto those platforms. Suggestions that the aid that we're sending from the West to Ukraine, whether it's financial aid or military aid, that's somehow going into a black hole. There was some disinformation that was being spread by Russian-connected social media accounts and on Russian state media, RT and Sputnik, suggesting that the weapons that were being sent to Ukraine were being sold off on the black market. That's a false story. It's been disproven by several fact-checking outlets. But again, all of this is intended to erode that trust, erode Western support for Ukraine, and unfortunately, we're seeing an impact of that. The impact is that certainly in the United States, we've seen over the past 12 months or so, support for Ukraine falling, especially among Americans who identify as Republicans. We know, of course, Fox News has been elements on Fox News. Tucker Carlson has been, actively promoting some of these narratives, especially the ones that align with the Kremlin, and so unfortunately they are having an impact, and of course what's said on Fox News unfortunately impacts, I think, some Canadians as well, and so we're seeing falling support for Ukraine amongst some Canadians who identify as being far right or on the right as well. So it is having an impact, unfortunately. And I'm sure that the Russian government knows this. The embassy is reporting this to the Kremlin, and so I think that we'll see a continued intensification of Russian information operations targeting Canada, and tailored messages, ones that are tailored to the far left and far right, because that's where they seem to be having the greatest effect. I think that overall, the impact isn't that great. I think most Canadians, most Americans, still support sending aid and support over to Ukraine. So that at least the center is holding, but there are cracks appearing on the extremes.
The old left and right that we saw in the 70s and 80s doesn't really exist anymore, but those who we believe are on the far left and far right are joining forces, and we've seen news coverage out of the U.S. of protests in Washington, D.C., where people from both sides of those far extremes were hand in hand, basically.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bob. I mean, I think that these old labels and the sort of the political compass that we've been using for the past several decades, I think it's sort of outdated. And I think it's important to know, when I say far left and far right in the context of Russian influence operations and amplification of some of these state narratives. When I say the far right, I don't mean conservatives. The far right, when I speak about the far right, it's more of an anti-democratic, illiberal, anti-NATO, anti-elitist group. They don't have much in common, if anything at all, with traditional conservatives. And I'd say much the same, with the left. I mean, when I'm talking about the far left, I'm not talking about mostly not supporters of the NDP or traditional socialists. These are people that might be identified as sort of anarcho-communists, also very illiberal, and also just like these, the illiberal far right that I was talking about earlier. These are individuals who are they're anti-elitist, they're anti-NATO, and I think on both sides they're just nihilists. They seem to be just against anything, any sort of authority, any sort of government, anything like that. And so in that sense, these two sides have come together. And it's funny, I was just watching American news on CNN and patrolling Fox for misinformation and disinformation narratives. And it was funny, I caught Tucker Carlson's show just was a couple of nights ago, and he actually had Robert Kennedy Jr. on, who of course announced his bid for the White House and challenging Joe Biden's nomination. And it's an awfully strange place, Tucker Carlson's show, for a sort of fairly left-leaning Democrat to be on. But it was a very strange interview. Tucker Carlson was very supportive of Kennedy and his views, but Robert F. Kennedy is much like Tucker Carlson is very much against the U.S. support for Ukraine. I'm not sure that I would call him anti-Ukrainian, but they're, like I said, both of them are against the U.S. sending any more aid to Ukraine. Robert F. Kennedy is also a fairly aggressive anti-vax supporter, was against the lockdowns, and in fact in 2020, in that summer, that first summer of COVID, I was monitoring Russian state media and their narratives about vaccinations and lockdowns. And Robert F. Kennedy was in Berlin giving a speech to a group called Querdenken, which is the German version of QAnon, at an anti-vaccination rally. That if you were watching this, you would think it's, and it wasn't just anti-vaccination; it was anti-government, anti-authority, anti-elite. you wouldn't be able to tell if you were to watch it whether this was a far left or far right rally. So the fact that that Robert Kennedy is on Tucker Carlson's show, I mean, I think we're seeing that horseshoe bending and getting awfully close, even in the mainstream.
My guest is Marcus Kolga of disinfowatch.org and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I asked Marcus Kolga about the evolution of extremists on opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah, well, we were tracking what was happening in the information space during COVID, and early on during the pandemic in early 2020, March and April. I think a lot of us who had been keeping a close eye on Russian information operations, a lot of us sort of anticipated that both the Russian and the Chinese governments would become quite active in that space, and indeed that is what happened. We saw Russia certainly exploiting the polarizing effects of the pandemic, the anti-vaccination movements, the anti-lockdown movements, and to be quite honest, Russia was already promoting anti-vaccination narratives, 2-3 years before the pandemic. Childhood vaccinations, they were promoting those narratives, and the WHO actually came out in I think it was 2018 or 2019, and basically said that Russian information, anti-vaccination, and vaccine hesitancy narratives were a serious problem, and that vaccine hesitancy in 2019 was the number one greatest global health risk, or health threat rather. And so we saw how Russia again exploited those narratives, and certainly running up towards the February of last year, we saw RT in Ottawa when we had the truck protests. RT sent a journalist to cover that on a daily basis, and RT was of course giving a platform to the most extremist voices in that movement. That's not to suggest that the entire movement was extremist, but there were certainly extremist voices within it, and specifically those voices that were calling for the overthrow of the Canadian government. These people who had probably for the year or two before that had an audience of about one when they were screaming into the mirrors in their bathrooms. Now RT gave these people an international platform, and through that the potential to legitimize their very, very extremist views. And what was interesting in February of last year, just as the war began, we were monitoring these social media accounts of a lot of these Canadian anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown groups, though especially the ones that were participating in the trucker convoy last year. And literally overnight, a lot of those accounts switched their narratives on the 24th of February, on the eve of the invasion, and they suddenly started directly retweeting Russian embassy posts, directly promoting pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian narratives. And it was just like a light switch, which was quite interesting. Now, whether that was organic or whether there was something organized behind it, it's unknown. But the fact that there is that close alignment on the extremes is concerning, and it's something that the Canadian government and we as a society, most importantly, need to start paying greater attention to make sure that those movements on the extreme don't expand, because that's exactly what the Russian government is hoping for, is to pour fuel onto some of those extreme narratives that are polarizing, in order to break down the cohesion within our society. And this is something that they've been doing for decades. They were doing it in the Cold War. It's well documented how they were doing it then, and they're doing it again. The problem is that during the Cold War, I think as a society, we had the cognitive resources, the ability to critically assess the information that we were receiving. Whereas now, we've lost that sort of muscle memory, where we don't have those same critical thinking skills as a society, and that's something that we need to change. We need to, make sure that the people in this country, all citizens, have those skills so that we can rebuild that resilience against these foreign information attacks.
And definitely a good place to go and learn about the skills is disinfowatch.org, which is your website. My guest, Marcus Kolga, is the founder of disinfowatch.org. Just in the last few moments we have, what couple of pieces of advice do you have for people who are listening so they can keep their eyes and ears open to disinformation and be prepared for it and deal with disinformation if they see it?
Well, I mean, first thing is that if you feel like you're using social media to get to most of your information, most of your news, try and change that habit. You know, we have wonderful newspapers, radio programs, even television news. If you're looking for information and news, get it from professional journalists. These are people that are trained to handle facts, responsibly. Journalists are people. Sometimes they get things a little bit wrong here and there, but all in all, they are professionals and they deal just in facts. So that's the first thing. Don't get all of your news from social media, because social media doesn't have those filters in place. It will, they will allow anything to get posted on those platforms, and it's not vetted. So don't exclusively get your information from social media. Make sure that you go to traditional media websites. Mainstream media is. I know that there are some partisan politicians who have tried to attack the credibility of mainstream media, but it's still that's the place to go for your news. The other thing is that when you are on social media and you do see headlines that may seem sensational, that trigger an emotional response in you, instead of liking it or sharing it, take a breath, step back, take a look at the platform, where it's coming from, what's the source. Check that. Make sure if it's coming from a website that you've never heard of, it's quite likely that it's maybe misinformation, it may be disinformation. But if it's not from a source you recognize, it's better not to share it at all. And the other thing that you can do is if the headline does seem sensational, run it through Google, run it through another search engine, check it to make sure that if there are other platforms, other credible professional media platforms that are sharing it, then great. Then I think you can trust what you're seeing. But check it first. Don't just share it. Don't just like it. And these are the just basic steps that we can take to ensuring that we're critically consuming the information that we see online and not just accepting everything that we see.
That was my guest, Marcus Kolga, the founder of disinfowatch.org and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad. Go to disinfowatch.org for more information. What do you think? Email bob@theBreaker.news. Time on the Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, Taiwan invites foreign visitors to spend night at presidential office. In 2019, 167 groups from 33 countries registered within just 19 days. Pictures and videos recorded during their stay attracted more than 30 million online views. The latest version forms part of the effort to revive international tourism in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Completed in 1919 by the Japanese colonial government as the office for its Governor General of Taiwan, and at the time the largest freestanding building in Asia. In the Kyoto news, Japan should brace for large 9th COVID wave, say experts. The number of coronavirus infections in Japan reported in the week through Tuesday was 1.06 times that of the previous week, with 33 out of the 47 prefectures logging an increase, according to the ministry. Health, Labor and Welfare Minister Katsunobu Kato said the number of new infections has been gradually increasing in Japan, while noting an increasing proportion of those being the XBB.1.5 Omicron subvariant. In the Hong Kong Free Press, Twitter removes labels for all news outlets, including Chinese state media. Hong Kong news outlets, including broadcaster RTHK and online media News, were among the organizations whose state-affiliated media labels were removed by the tech platform. The tags for other Chinese state media, such as Global Times, People's Daily, Xinhua, and CGTN, as well as for Russian state media, were also scrapped. State media journalists, including Global Times commentator Hu Xijin, were no longer labeled. Twitter is blocked in China, however, many Chinese outlets, officials, and journalists circumvent the block to use it. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.News podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.News podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In the Oregonian, Portland Police Union and City reach compromise on body-worn cameras. The U.S. Department of Justice has given conditional approval to apply the policy to a 2-month pilot project outfitting officers from one patrol precinct and a specialized gun violence team with body cameras. The sticking point has been whether to allow officers who use deadly force to view camera footage before writing their reports or being interviewed by investigators. On King 5, police do not condone Nerf War game played by Gig Harbor teens. After multiple cases of young people getting shot for common mistakes across the country, police worry that teens could be mistaken for prowlers during the game. The Nerf War is a popular tradition in the area where high school students shoot other teammates with foam bullets from Nerf guns in hopes of winning prize money at the end. In Czech news, rising STI rates among Canada's seniors prompts educational campaign. Germs, a body-safe condom company, says sexually transmitted illnesses in those aged 60 and up are on the rise, making for some difficult situations in seniors' homes across the country. The BC Centre for Disease Control reported that by the end of December 2022, there were around 1,000 cases of chlamydia, more than 200 accounts of gonorrhea, and slightly less than 150 cases of syphilis across the aging population of BC residents that were 60 and older. And finally, I contributed to the Wall Street Journal's coverage last weekend of the Donbass Devushka and the connection to the leak of classified U.S. intelligence documents. I helped confirm the involvement in the pro-Russian social media network of Oak Harbor, Washington Navy veteran Sarah Bills. Go to WSJ.com to read the stories or Google these headlines. Social media account overseen by former Navy non-commissioned officer helped spread secrets. And FBI investigating ex-Navy non-commissioned officer linked to pro-Russia social media account. That's Cascadia Calling on this edition of the Breaker.News podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.News podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo Bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to Teachers of British Columbia. It's Education Week from April 24th to 28th, so a tip of the hat to teachers. Thank you for supporting students and building strong communities through education. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo Bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.News podcast for the week of April 23rd, 2023. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 23rd of April in 1914, the first baseball game played at Chicago's Wrigley Field? Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/thebreakernews. That's patreon.com/thebreakernews. Until next week.